Hello, and thank you for tuning into Associate Gulf Coast Staying Home and Staying Connected webinar series. My name is Alex Turner, and I am a Business Development Manager for Associate Gulf Coast Management. We manage homeowners associations, condominiums, co-ops, mobile home parks, and we service from as far south as Marco Island all the way to just short of Orlando. Before we move on to today's webinar, I just want to take a second and really say hello to you guys out there. A big part of my job is to get out and meet and greet people at events, luncheons, seminars, trade shows, and in this COVID climate, we know that is not possible. We miss meeting you and seeing your faces, but we are not going to let this stop us from bringing education and information you need to the safety of your own home. We have a great library of COVID-19 information as it relates to board members and your association. So please give me a call or send me an email if you have any questions or need any resources to help you manage your association during this time. I just want to be a resource for you. And with that said, I'm very excited to introduce our webinar today on emergency powers. We are so fortunate to have attorney George Root from Frisha and Ross with us to go over emergency powers and other topical information that sort of is changing from day to day. Thank you for being with us today, George.
Thank you for having me, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here. As Alex said, my name is George Root. I'm an attorney with Frisch and Ross. We solely represent community associations around Florida as general counsel. That's all we do. We've received a lot of questions in the last couple of weeks with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic regarding the emergency power provisions in the applicable statutes. For HOAs, it's 720.316, co-ops, it's 719.128, and condos, it's 718.1265. The statutes are all very similar and have a lot of the same provisions, so you need to read them very carefully and familiarize yourself with them. Boards should be very careful, though, before employing any of these emergency powers. You should consult with your attorney before taking any emergency actions.
George,
you have to balance. Go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. We agree, and I just want to ask a quick question on that. Do the individual documents cover emergency powers at all, or is this something they would just strictly go to what the state is doing or their local government?
Every association is going to need to dig into their governing documents with their counsel to see what emergency provisions are in there. You're definitely going to need to look at your governing documents because they will talk about how to employ emergency powers as well. There's also a school of thought that the emergency power provisions in these individual statutes may not apply to the current emergency, and so let's dig into that a little bit. If you read the first paragraph of most of these three statutory provisions, they're all pretty similar. They start about the same. To the extent allowable by law, unless specifically prohibited by the declaration or other governing documents, in response to damage caused by an event for which a state of emergency is declared, may exercise specifically enumerated powers. That's a whole lot to unpack right there. I think to the extent allowable by law portion is pretty important there because it limits to some degree the employment of those emergency powers. Also, you have the unless specifically prohibited by your governing documents, so that kind of answers your questions, Alex, as far as you need to also look at your governing documents before employing any emergency powers. And the word damage that's used there is not specifically defined in any of those statutes. These emergency powers were drafted and contemplated with hurricanes and other similar natural disasters in mind, not necessarily the type of pandemic we're dealing with now. I imagine in the next couple of years, the legislators are going to look at this and probably expand these powers and be more specific to include this type of emergency. These powers, it's obvious that my practitioners around the state have some debate about whether these emergency powers apply in this situation. head of the DBPR, Division of Business and Professional Regulation, issued an executive order recently trying to extend these emergency powers to the current situation. And there's debate as to whether she has the authority to do that. So, like I said earlier, it still applies now. You need to speak with your attorney before employing any emergency powers, because there is debate and question as to whether all these emergency powers will apply to the current situation.
Okay.
Some of the things that the emergency provisions allow, and the emergency order issued by the governor and then by DBPR allow, is they define emergency management officials as clarified to include public health officials. They also extend some of the timing requirements for filing the condominium cooperative financial reports. They're essentially suspended and told. That actually takes place in Emergency Order 2020-04.
That's great.
And Alex, I believe you had some information regarding SunBiz deadlines.
Right. So we just learned that SunBiz has also extended the annual report deadlines to be filed to June 30th. So if your association's annual meeting has been delayed, or you're having trouble getting it completed, they have given a little bit of time extension on that. And if you did want to get it done now, you certainly can, and just amend it later on when you have your annual meeting.
Previously, we were talking about whether or not the emergency provisions in the statutes applied to the current crisis. So let's talk about what some of those emergency powers are. The way they're enumerated in the statute, it allows them to conduct meetings, a board to conduct meetings after notices given as practicable as possible. Sometimes if it's an emergent situation, you may not be able to give 48-hour notice. Some of the other emergency provisions are the canceling and rescheduling of meetings, designating assistant officers or directors, and I think that's a particularly important power, and one that boards should be thinking of right now, because if you have multiple board members or your entire board comes down with corona and they're in the hospital, you're going to need someone to step into their shoes. So they should go ahead and try to consider that now and find replacement board members should an emergent situation arise. I think that's probably one of the more important ones you'll see here. They may have the power to relocate association's principal office or designate an alternative. Based on guidance of emergency management officials, they may be able to determine a portion of the property unavailable for entry or occupancy. I think you see that a lot of people may be closing clubhouses and pools and relying on this provision, right, among others, to shut those down. Mm-hmm. And the last portion about mitigating further damage kind of piggybacks off that a little bit as well. The unique feature about what we're dealing with now with COVID-19 is that we're not supposed to be gathering in groups of greater than 10. That's another reason you see folks shutting down clubhouses, common area amenities, pools, and the like, so that we can employ social distancing measures easier and we can stay 6 feet apart. As far as we get a lot of questions about membership and board meetings and architectural control meetings. Folks are going to have to start at some point implementing some teleconferencing and video conferencing and or postponing and canceling meetings for the time being. You should always consult with your attorney and your professionals such as Alex before taking these measures.
What is the best way? We're getting calls at Associa from boards who are trying to shut down amenities, and what is the best way for them to handle it if they have non-compliant people? And I think we're going to start seeing less of that probably now that we have the stay-at-home order. But when we have members that aren't, they're not respecting the shutdown of the amenities, or there's kids playing in big groups out in the parking lot or something like that, what is the board's role to take care of and enforce the amenity shutdowns?
Arguably, I think that the association does have the power to shut down some of these common areas and amenities and gathering places. And as the they're in control of an entity, and that entity essentially controls the common areas. So I think they have the right to shut it down. And if somebody trespasses, I mean, that's essentially a trespass. I would arguably, if somebody goes onto an area that's been closed, maybe you don't want to skip right away to calling police and having them trespassed. Ways that you can avoid getting to that point is posting notices on the physical property, sending community-wide notices, posting them on bulletin boards, maybe mailing out a newsletter, letting folks know and members know what changes have been made. And you can also treat it like any other violation and send violation warning letters. Maybe if the violations become more egregious, you think about fining or other measures. I would want to caution boards not to physically take action themselves, because you put yourself at risk to liability. You also put yourself at risk to corona. So don't take the law into your own hands. I don't think it hurts from 6 feet away to remind folks of the measures you've taken, but be careful about taking the law into your own hands. Sure. Is what I would caution boards to do.
And let's talk about annual meetings, because right now we're sort of in the height of annual meeting season. This sort of first quarter, or actually we're in the second quarter now. But for those boards who want to push forward with their annual meeting, taking the precautions and the avenues allowed by the emergency powers, how do these boards, can they still do an election this way, or is it just holding the meeting, or how does that work with elections?
Luckily, many of my clients have gotten past election season, or election season, annual meeting season is pretty far in the future, but there are a few folks that are probably due up for an annual meeting. And the approach is different for condos and HOAs. The condo statute drives the election annual meeting process largely for condominiums, whereas the homeowner associations are driven mainly by the governing documents. I think you want to be, with the requirements and restrictions right now related to the pandemic, arguably I don't think you should be having annual meetings. If it's possible to postpone them, you probably should. Some of the things that I'm seeing that we usually see in governing documents is you'll see requirements that annual meetings and elections occur, on a certain date, certain every year, or once every calendar year, or no later than 18 months. You see those type of things. And so there is a chance that we're going to run afoul of one or more of these provisions in governing documents by canceling or postponing meetings. I think the emergency powers and the situation at hand dictates that we have to postpone these. The hope is that in a couple of months, the social distancing requirements and other restrictions will recede a little bit to where we can have open meetings with everyone present. If we don't get to that point, then each board is going to need to sit down with council and tailor a very specific plan that tries to meet the requirements in the governing documents in the statute, and at the same time, protects the health, safety, and welfare of the membership. Many clients don't have, there's a lot of clients that may not have contested elections, so this may not become an issue.
Right.
You'll see this become more of an issue when you have hotly contested membership where folks aren't happy with the board.
Sure.
But you really need to sit down with council before making those calls.
I just had one other question on this, and this pertains to let's call them like golf course communities with memberships, and let's say you have a designated food and beverage that you have to meet every month. So a question came up that do we still have to pay the food and beverage requirement while the kitchen is shut down at the the clubhouse?
Well, I think you're really going to want to pull out the contract and look at that. I don't think that's an easy, straightforward, off-the-cuff answer without digging into the contract and reading the course of performance provisions and the expectations between the parties. I'm sure there's probably a way to, parts of the contract may be negated by the current crisis, by an inability to perform, but I would not want to make a call on that without looking at the contract closely.
Yeah, right.
Um, the emergency powers provisions in Florida or the emergency provisions cited in the statutes we enumerated earlier talk about 617.0830, which basically talks about fiduciary duty, good faith, that kind of thing. So, board members should remember, even in these times, that you have an obligation to conduct yourselves with good faith, with the care of an ordinarily prudent person, in a manner reasonably believed to be in the best interest of your corporation. As a director, you can rely on professionals and opinions and reports to make these decisions. However, if you have knowledge knowing that certain aspects of these reports or opinions or information, your reliance is unwarranted, then you have a duty not to rely on them. That's basic information for all times, not just this emergent situation. Alex, do you have any other questions for me?
Yeah, I do. I just have some follow-up questions. We did ask some of our board members and just taking some situational um, communicate to you. When we're talking about essential services like landscapers or pool cleaners, if a board wanted to take this time where their clubhouses are shut down or their amenities are shut down and use this time to improve them, whether it be putting new flooring in, painting, resurfacing the tennis court or whatever it may be, not necessarily essential, but are they allowed to take the steps to do this?
I think a lot of folks are looking at these stay-at-home orders and they're looking for ways that it doesn't apply to them. And I think what people are missing is that the spirit of the order is to look for ways to go about, to not go out and about, and to stay home and be responsible members of society and to protect each other. I would recommend avoiding non-essential improvement projects. However, there's a big difference between John going 100 yards from his home to the clubhouse to do a painting project by himself than a spring breaker on the beach partying. If there, so the nature of a home improvement project or a neighborhood improvement project inside a clubhouse, if they're going to do that, then follow the CDC guidelines, stagger your shifts, stay 6 feet apart, heighten your sanitizing protocols, and take other precautions. But generally, I'm going to probably advise them to try to avoid that. The social distancing protocols won't be in place forever, and they will relax in the near future, hopefully, and that's probably a better time to do that.
Okay. And if they were contracting out for this to let's say a professional painting company, not the board, not doing it themselves, what is the onus then on the painting company to decide whether that's something that they want to take the risk in doing?
I think the conservative advice would be to the board to be proactive, and if it's not an essential service, then put it off for a time being. That's the conservative advice.
Okay.
You may be able to get away with letting some that are not quite non-essential come in and do business, but the most conservative approach is to just not do non-essential work at this time.
Got it. Okay. Can you touch on the new order, or the new resolution for vacation rentals that we've just seen? I'm getting lots of questions regarding how this applies to regular rentals that are happening in the community, whether they be annual rentals or 6-month rentals, or how does that work, and how do we distinguish between those?
I think if you're a person that owns a vacation rental and does that, you need to download the Executive Order 20-87 and take a close look at it. And I'll give you some of the highlights and my thoughts on it. It talks about vacation rentals. It refers to Florida statute 509.242, which defines vacation rentals as any unit or group of units in a condominium or cooperative or any individually or collective owned single family house or dwelling unit that's a transient public lodging establishment. And then it specifically excludes timeshare projects. But the order goes on to say that it's basically banning vacation rentals, and then it qualifies and said a rental of any house, condominium, dwelling unit that is a transient public lodging establishment pursuant to 509.0134A And then it gives some timelines for periods less than 30 days. So that would lead one to conclude that if your rental is longer than 30 days, you may be okay. It also, later on in the order, talks about businesses that are specifically excluded from the order, and that includes hotels, motels, inns, resorts, non-transient properties. Long-term rentals is specifically excluded. So that, in conjunction with the 30-day limitation, I think if you're renting it out for 3-4 months, longer than 30 days, you're probably good. If your rental was booked prior to the effective date of the order, I believe is March 28th, 2020, you're probably good. If you're renting to military personnel, emergency personnel, government, health, infrastructure response, any of the super essential businesses and non-vacation rentals, then you probably have the ability to do the shorter term rentals. In short, if you're in the business, vacation rental business, sit down with your general counsel or an attorney to see if your specific situation applies.
Sorry about that. Okay, and then let's talk about if a member of an association were to contract COVID-19 or be required to self-quarantine because of exposure. What is the board's requirements or best practices when it comes to that? What's the do's and don'ts of this situation?
Well, I've seen a lot of debate on this issue with my fellow practitioners around the state. I think you have to tread pretty carefully here, and I think our guidance is going to continue to evolve because we're seeing new executive orders fly out every day. I don't think HIPAA applies. HIPAA is the federal regulation regarding medical records. HOAs are not a covered entity subject to HIPAA and its penalties, or at least that's my opinion. However, state privacy laws may apply, and I don't know whether Florida's privacy rights give way to public health and public safety concerns. They may in this situation. If a person is willingly self-reporting but did not authorize the board to share their identity, it may cause the board a lot of problems if they then share that identity. I think they're probably safer if they become aware of a contracted case in the association to maybe put folks on notice that there's a risk involved and be careful, isolate yourselves, quarantine, get tested when you can. Like I said, the safer bet would be to disclose to community that the resident has tested positive and let the resident identify themselves if that's what they want to do and who they've had contact with and when. My understanding that the medical personnel, when you test positive, will question you to find out who may have been exposed so that they can reach out to those that have been exposed. You want to be careful to violate someone's privacy. Naming them without consent is pretty dicey, but I do not think it violates HIPAA.
Great. In the case this was a question that came up. In the case of gated communities, whether they're manned or not, does the emergency order change the way restricted access functions?
Obviously, it's going to be a little bit different for manned versus unmanned. I think you're going to want to be very careful about restricting access and try to put unless the government gets to a point where they're issuing certificates for essential employees to go around. How are we going as an HOA, and I'm sure some folks may disagree with, how are we going to determine who's essential? If a construction activity is essential, how do we know that Bob's roof repairs are not essential, or which construction activities on his property are essential versus non? I think your best approach is maybe to send a newsletter out to your membership at this point saying, please do not have non-essential folks coming into your house and that kind of thing into the neighborhood. So, I think you want to ask the membership to step up at this point. As the guidance continues to evolve, maybe we get to a point where we have manned gates checking essential personnel certificates, but I don't think the restrictions, executive orders are at that point yet.
Okay. George, any other final comments that you want to say before we close out today?
I think the main take-home point should be work closely with your general counsel, whoever it may be, because each set of governing documents is unique. This is a very factually based determination with a lot of these questions. There's no right off the cuff answer for these situations that folks are facing, and new orders, restrictions, and guidance are coming out daily. So please consult attorney and professionals such as Alex and Associate Gulf Coast, and work with your professional. That's why you hired them, to value their advice and guidance.
Well, thanks for all the info today, George, and thanks for taking some time with us. We're really trying to stay in front of our board members and potential board members and just giving them this information. So we thank you for your information today. If your association needs anything during this time, I'd like to be of service to you, whether that be COVID information, board certifications, vendor contract referrals, info on management. Please feel free to give me a shout. Again, I'm Alex Turner with Associate Gulf Coast at 239-207-5774. And thanks again, George. We appreciate your time today.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you. Everyone stay safe out there.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody.